Hi everyone, I'm Phil Liggett and welcome to the 1991 Tour de France, which started this year in Lyon, a town trying to rid itself of the industrial image and do what everybody does these days and present the green image. This year's Tour de France was different. It was a long way down to Pau and through the Pyrenees, then across the bottom up to Gap, and then through the Alps with, of course, Alpe d'Huez, the shrine of world cycling, awaiting them. On through Milan with the time trial, and finally into the Champs-Élysées and, of course, the Eiffel Tower. The Tour de France first began in 1903, and Lyon was on its route then. Nowadays, the ride is coming here for only the 14th time, and the time trial began in the Parc de la Tête d'Or, where the image was one of tranquility, but it was to welcome 198 of the world's best bike riders, all broken up into 22 teams. 5.4 kilometres the opening time trial, the prologue, the hors d'oeuvre if you like, to the 2,300 miles or near 4,000 kilometres of this year's Tour de France. Greg LeMond was back. He'd hardly won a race since he won the Tour de France 1 year ago, but he was wearing number 1. The Tour de France inspires him. Would it also inspire Claudio Chiappucci or previous winner Pedro Delgado? And of course, everybody was talking about Eric Breukink, the man who nearly has won the Tour de France but hasn't yet. The new champion of Italy, Gianni Bugno, coming as the world's new number 1. Miguel Indurain, a rider who's always been in the shadow of team captain Delgado. And Charlie Motte, a year ago, said the Tour de France was never for him. Could he win it this time? And the return of Jean-François Bernard, a former yellow jersey of the Tour de France, and a twice winner too, another Frenchman, Laurent Fignon. But this opening prologue time trial was to have a familiar beginning. Twice winner already of prologues in Berlin and last year in Futuroscope, the Frenchman Thierry Marey on Fignon's Castorama squad was coming home with the best time. Best time to date, Francis Moreau, 6 minutes 18.34 seconds. Thierry Marey, who loves these opening prologue time trials, was to go a lot quicker than that. The race for the first yellow jersey, Marey was on top, 6 minutes 11.23. So the Frenchman, for the third time in his career, was pulling on the first maillot jaune, and the famous Credit Lyonnais line had found its first home. The next day, the race started from outside the Parc de la Tête d'Or, the same start and finishing line, a circuit of 114.5 kilometres around Lyon. And if any of you have ever been to Lyon, you know the roads around the city are very hilly. Thierry Marey, smiling here, surely didn't expect to be the leader by the end of the day. The field rolled off, led here by Michel Dernisse, the winner of the Kellogg's Tour of Britain just a year ago. These opening 11 stages were basically flat, although this particular stage was on narrow roads. The riders were worried about the course. They were particularly worried about the approaches to the finish in Lyon. They were very tortuous. One rider quickly on the attack was Rolf Yerman. Another one quickly on the fore was Atle Volsvoll, a valued teammate of Greg LeMond when the mountains were due. But Volsvoll now was to lose almost 18 minutes, and of course it was to take him all tour to recover from those injuries. Well, you thought the big favourites would have learned, wouldn't you? A year ago, the race was almost decided on the opening day by a 4-man breakaway, which contained Claudio Chiappucci and Ronan Pensek, Franz Masson and Steve Bauer. Well, this breakaway of 10, which established on the first stage, contained Raul Alcala, Greg LeMond, Sean Kelly and in green, Eric Breukink. These were danger men for the future of the destiny of the winner of the Tour de France. The field behind were losing over 2.25 minutes. Greg LeMond had paid attention. He'd also come here with no wins this season. Yet once the Tour de France begins, his tail is up and his target is clear. Jean-François Bernard, thinking of Pedro Delgado and his other teammate Miguel Indurain, was driving the chase. Greg LeMond was driving the breakaway. Ralph Yarman had taken an early lead in the King of the Mountains, but when it came to the sprint finish back at the Parc de la Tête d'Or, it was a new name we had to learn, Djamolidine Abdoujaparov, who was leading out from Sean Kelly. The Soviet sprinter won the stage, Kelly was second, and Greg LeMond was third. LeMond had finished third in the opening prologue time trial, third now in the first road race. He was in the leader's yellow jersey. It was 1 minute and 44 seconds before the main field arrived, led home by Jean-Paul van Poppel and the other sprinter Johan Museeuw. But that was a lot to lose on the opening day. There was a sensation too a couple of hours later in the afternoon's team time trial out at nearby Bron. Stephen Roche had gone off for a natural break. He'd come back and found his team had already started. He had been given the wrong start time, he said. The commissaires at first said he was disqualified. Roche countered and said, "You can't disqualify me, you can only eliminate me." Well, it was a lonely ride, and in fact, when he got to the end, Stephen Roche, the winner of the Tour de France in '87, was eliminated. It was to be the day for the Ariostoia team, and they learned the ups and downs of the Tour de France. On the very last bend, 3 of them touched wheels and went down. One of them was Rolf Sørensen. He hoped he was destined for the leader's yellow jersey. The team came home and recorded the best time. And then a few seconds later, Sørensen came home and he did become the new leader of the Tour de France. Castorama, still hoping to keep their man Laurent Fignon in the frame, and perhaps too Thierry Marie, recorded the second best time of the day. It wasn't good enough to give Thierry Marie his race leader's yellow jersey back, although he led them home. The Panasonic team, well, they used to be unbeatable in the old name of the Rally McGregor team. Nowadays they are fallible. Even so, they recorded the third best time of the day. And a rare look at the PDM team. Rare because very soon the whole team will be out of the Tour de France. At this stage though, there was no story at all. Nobody knew what was about to hit this team in a few days' time. Greg LeMond in the leader's yellow jersey was inspired, pushing, pulling and dragging his Z team along the flat roads. Was he making the team work just a little bit too hard, too soon? Philippe Casado brought them round towards the finish. LeMond was in third place, Robert Miller was there as well.
C'est comme l'année passée, tout le monde me critique pour pas gagner des étapes, mais moi je veux gagner Tour de France, après les étapes, après garder le maillot jaune.
Greg LeMond left nobody in any doubt that he'd come here to win the Tour de France again. But for the moment, the yellow jersey was on the shoulders of the Danish rider Rolf Sørensen, 10 seconds ahead of Greg LeMond, 12 seconds ahead of Erik Breukink. Denmark had found themselves a new star, because Rolf Sørensen was also the leader in the World Cup Series. Sean Kelly had moved up into 4th place. Rudy Donald, the world champion, was riding high in 5th. But for the moment at least, the interim sprints along the route for the small-time bonuses were very important, especially to riders like Djamolidine Abdoujaparov. The Soviet rider was lying in 6th place, just 47 seconds off the lead. There was always a chance he could steal the leader's yellow jersey, at least until the mountains. On this 210-kilometre stage from Villeurbanne to Dijon, there were plenty of attacks, but nobody could consolidate a good lead. This was Sami Morels, and then he was being chased by Pelis Ruiz Capestany and the Danish rider Jesper Skibby. So Morels had company, and together they worked well, but the Ariostoia team were working equally well in search of keeping their leader at the head of affairs. Gianni Bugno, wearing the champion of Italy's jersey, was always looking for a move. And then, some 3 kilometres from the finish, when it looked as though all of the field were coming together, the sprinter Etienne de Wilde fooled them all. Jumping clear, the man who wins 6-day races and then races through the summer, normally winning bike races with his sprint, had fooled them all. He was out on his own, they were catching him, but not soon enough. And behind him came the best sprinters. In 2nd place, Jean-Paul van Poppel, 3rd, Olaf Ludwig, 4th, Abdoujaparov, 5th, Museeuw, and 6th, Laurent Jalabert. I don't think there are any sprinters in the world left. In that sprint finish at the back of the field, Henri Manders and the world champion, Rudy Donans, were left on the floor, happily without serious injury. So Etienne de Wilde, who'd won a stage of the race at Bordeaux last time, had now won it here. Nothing changed overall, and on the 4th stage we headed out from Dijon to Reims, or as we like to say in English, Reims. 286 kilometres, the race continued through the beautiful Champagne countryside. small hills along the route had become a battle for Peter de Klerk, a lotto rider who had built a small lead in the King of the Mountains. He was also annoying the bike riders because he was always attacking, just when they thought they might be able to potter along. The feeding station with Britain's Sean Yates in the lead here, the race was all together. 197 riders still in the race, the only man to retire, Stephen Roche. Claudio Chiappucci happy to stay in the field, Stephen Hodge, the Australian. Peter de Klerk. And everybody keeping the race under control, especially the Ariostia team. One of the riders most upset by the disappearance of Stephen Roche was his brother Lawrence Roche, relying on him heavily in this first Tour de France to give him advice. He seemed to be settling in though, he'd gone out on the attack. Others had chased him down and he'd been swept up. Gianni Bugno then tested the water and joined by fellow Italian Maurizio Fondriest. But they weren't allowed to get too far, and amongst the chasers to bring them back was Djamolidine Abdoujaparov. In the big sprint finish, again he showed everybody how to sprint, although it's not the recommended way. Watch the rider in the pink as he comes up on the inside on the rails. That's Johan Museeuw, and he's pinned up against the Coca-Cola sign and the objects, but in fact the sprint was clean, and Abdoujaparov led home Olaf Ludwig, Sean Kelly and Jan Schur. It had been close, Uwe Raber's fifth, and Museeuw only finished in the end in sixth place. In a matter of 100 metres, he'd gone right back in the bunch. The bunch sprint was contested, in fact, by 152 riders, and Lawrence Roche finished over 15 minutes behind. His attack had exhausted him. So the Soviet sprinter, building quite a reputation as a sprinter, had also won 2 stages now. Still no change overall as the riders waved farewell to Reims. Sorensen led by 10 seconds from Greg LeMond, 12 seconds from Eric Breukink and 14 seconds from Sean Kelly. Abdoujaparov was closing in. He was just 23 seconds back in 5th place. And so it was the 5th stage too, between Reims and Valenciennes, 149.5 kilometres. Again, there were plenty of attacks. Peter de Klerk wearing his polka dot jersey now as leader of the King of the Mountains. And other riders on the attack too, including Marshal Gaillon. As the riders headed across the Valenciennes, the skies were blue and the air temperature was very, very warm. But riders fought hard to keep the field together, especially the Z team. Greg LeMond making his team work hard to keep him in with a chance of taking the overall lead. And so as they approached the finish, Jelle Nijdam, a specialist at breaking away in the last kilometre, did it again. The field had broken up in the last 5 kilometres because of a number of crashes. Jelle Nijdam wins the stage by a single second from Remming Stumpf, Olaf Ludwig and Andreas Kappes. But there was drama further down the road. Because of the number of roundabouts, tight bends and narrow roads, that was blamed for a crash, and the man who was the principal victim was the yellow jersey Rolf Sorensen. Sorensen was out of the Tour de France, although he left the end of this stage saying he would have his shoulder looked at and would return for the start next day. Unfortunately, his collarbone was broken and the yellow jersey was out of the race. In keeping with Tour tradition, Greg LeMond refused to take on board the leader's yellow jersey, so as the race rolled away from Arras heading towards Le Havre, there was no leader of the Tour de France. The yellow jersey was up for grabs. The man who went out in search of it was the local man, Thierry Marie, the very same rider we'd seen win the opening prologue. As I said earlier, Marie has won the prologue twice before and lost his yellow jersey soon afterwards and never won it back. This time he was searching to retrieve the yellow jersey, and he set off on a breakaway of 235 kilometres. The field, like most of the observers, thought he must be mad. Well, in fairness to Thierry Marie, it's a good job he's a pro bike rider. He'd make a lousy singer. The race began to take up the chase, but by now Marie had built too much of a lead. The crowd were loving every minute of it. On local radio, they knew now a local man was heading the Tour de France towards Le Havre. It's a long way, 259 kilometres. Marie knew he had to attack early on. After 6 hours and 38 minutes, Thierry Marie came home the winner of this stage of the Tour de France, the 6th, by 1 minute and 54 seconds. A new sprinter was emerging as well, Remig Stumpf. He was taking on Abdoujaparov. Abdoujaparov in the green, Remig Stumpf right behind him. And as Stumpf sees the finishing line, he finds just that little extra effort to give him second place. Abdoujaparov was third, Kelly was fourth, and further back down the road, Marshal Gaillon was again in trouble. And this time, he was out of the Tour de France. Thierry Marie back in the leader's yellow jersey a few days after winning the opening prologue at Lyon. He was now going to have to face up to stage number 7 to Argentin, a ride of 167 kilometres away from Le Havre. All of the efforts of yesterday were well worth it. Thierry Marie is a very popular figure in this part of the world, and in fact when he's not riding in the big races, he's out training with the club boys. The Pont de Tonqueville, the main field, heading up here as they began to wind their way down towards Argentin. And a crash as the field narrowed down to go through the toll gates. It took out of the Tour de France one of the men we expected to animate in the mountains, Fabio Parra. The race went on. Thierry Marie's overall lead was 1 minute and 4 seconds ahead of Sean Kelly. Abdoujaparov was now up to third overall, 1 minute 7 seconds back. Robert Miller, also a faller on this early stage, because there have been plenty of crashes so far in this year's Tour de France. And no, they hadn't changed the last vehicle in the Tour de France either. Greg LeMond kept in touch with his director sportif by wearing a radio helmet. He said he could hear him, but apparently the director sportif couldn't hear Greg. Every attack during the day came to naught. Thierry Marie was still in with a chance of holding on to that leader's yellow jersey as the race came down towards the finish. The first time, in fact, Argentin had ever welcomed the Tour de France. There's always someone willing to attack in the Tour, but the big field were extremely vigilant. And so all that was left now was for the big sprint in the town itself. Sean Kelly knew who he wanted to win, and that was his team sprinter, Jean-Paul Van Poppel. He worked very hard, along with the rest of the PDM boys, to keep this race in one big group. There was the usual small attack in the closing kilometres, but the big field soon pounced and they all came in together. Now watch the speed of arguably the fastest sprinter in the world, Jean-Paul Van Poppel, as he heads into town with the whole field, all 184 of them, right behind. Van Poppel beat Johan Museeuw, Jan Schur and Laurent Jalabert. Overall, Thierry Marie kept his leader's yellow jersey. Jean-Paul Van Poppel won the stage, and the demon sprinter Abdoujaparov was now up into second place, 59 seconds behind Thierry Marie. The important time trial, the first long time trial of this year's Tour de France, was 73 kilometres between Argentin and Alençon. Gianni Bugno was expected now to put in a challenge. He was in fact to finish only 5th, 1 minute 31 seconds behind the winner. Eric Breukink, leading all the way, cracked in the last few kilometres inexplicably. It was to be explained perhaps later in the week. He finally finished only 4th, 1 minute 14 seconds down. And the return of the great Frenchman, Jean-François Bernard, who couldn't find a place on a French team, so he went to race on the Spanish Banesto team. He was back, a third-place performance, 53 seconds down on the winner. and Greg LeMond, who's laid the foundation for many of his victories in the Tours de France by riding the time trial best. He wasn't to win this one though, but he was to prove to us all he was back to form. Second place for Greg LeMond, just 8 seconds behind the winner. But who was the winner? Well, it was a surprise when Miguel Indurain, trailing Eric Breukink at the first few checks, suddenly came to the last one with the best time. He held on well, and the big man from Spain was about to lay down his claim to victory in this year's Tour de France. When Stephen Roach won in 1987, he scored in the big time trial. Indurain, on the back wheel there of Sean Yates, was coming home with the best time. He was now going to be the man to beat, with the Pyrenees still to come.
¿Ahora está muy en confianza antes de la montaña?
No, todo el Tour, ¿no? Está bien mentalizado para afrontar el Tour y ahora mejor con esta victoria de etapa.
The new leader, though, was Greg LeMond. He'd been riding now for almost 32 hours and he built a gap of 1 minute and 13 seconds over Eric Breukink. Abdoujaparov was still there too in third place. Indurain was fourth. The riders prepared now for the 161 kilometres ride onwards towards Rennes. So as they came down towards the finish, there was to be a new name in the history of the Tour de France. Mauro Ribeiro of Brazil. No Brazilian ever before has won a stage in the Tour de France, and Ribeiro broke clear in the last kilometre or so to the line. The small breakaway group, try as they might, the sprinters have been robbed, and one of the best sprinters, Jalabert, was going to have to be content with second place. Ribeiro was to win his first ever stage, and indeed Brazil's first ever stage in the Tour de France. Was he happy? He should be. Professional riders, no matter how experienced they become, always want to win a stage in the Tour de France. So there was a new name to conjure with, and he rides for a French team, so the French recognised him as well. But there was still the same name on top of the overall classification. Greg LeMond leading Eric Breukink by 1 minute and 13 seconds. Abdoujaparov third, 1 minute 15 seconds. Miguel Indurain fourth, 2 minutes 17 seconds behind. And feeling so far the Tour had gone according to plan. Racing through Bretagne, there was an attack by val-louron. And the chase down was coming from the Panasonics. There was also a rumour that the PDM team had come to the start ill. And in fact, at the start that morning, Uwe Raab hadn't started, and neither had Nico Verhoeven. The rumour was that the team had caught a virus, or was it food poisoning? Eric Breukink was not looking at all well, but he was still staying in the main field, defending his second place overall. The same couldn't be said for two others. Martin Early and Jean-Paul Van Poppel, the stage winner a couple of days ago, were both off the back of the race and about to give up the cause. total and absolute disaster it was for PDM team Volk Boden, the East German member of the team and former world champion. He was riding off the back and knew he would be eliminated, but he wouldn't give up the day's racing. At the front, a breakaway went clear, containing Phil Anderson, Nico Emmons, Brian Holm and Michel Dernice as they raced down towards Quimper. The ride had been a long one, 207 kilometres. It had been eternal for the PDM team. Phil Anderson won his stage, beating Emmons, Holm and Dernice. Just 6 seconds later, Abdoujaparov led the rest home in 5th place. The Australian was having arguably his best ever season. But the talk wasn't about the great victory by Phil Anderson, his first since the early 80s. It was all about the demise of the PDM team. Eric Breukink, Raoul Alcala, Volk Boden, Martin Early, Sean Kelly, Uwe Raab, Jos van Aert, Jean-Paul van Poppel, Nico Verhoeven. They'd either not started, given up on the way, been eliminated at the finish, or simply were not feeling well enough to come out for the 11th stage next morning. The official story in the end was that they had taken some liquid food intravenously, and the feeling was it hadn't been quite up to what it should have been. So on the morning of the 11th stage from Quimper to Saint-Herblain, 246 kilometres, the whole of the PDM team had withdrawn and were already on their way home. So the great little Frenchman, who said he couldn't win the Tour de France a year ago, was now a stage winner. Peter de Klerk was still in the lead in the King of the Mountains, and Djamolidine Abdoujaparov was in second place, but easily leading in the points section. The yellow jersey, by 51 seconds over Abdoujaparov, Greg LeMond was the leader of the Tour de France, and the mountains were still to come. But the man of the day was Charlie Motte, and this is what happens after you've won a stage in the Tour de France. LeMond mustn't have been looking when Charlie Motte attacked because he was on his left shoulder. After the waving of the flowers, it's off to meet the press. And after that, it's off to meet the television. Greg LeMond still isn't sure how he won it. A little climb, he said, about a kilometre out. And after being on television, it's off to the medical control. An autograph on the way. Well, let's hope it doesn't take too long. And out he comes. Under the escort of Philippe Soud, chef de presse of the Tour de France, it's now over to a waiting car. There's still the rest of the press to meet, but they're down at the press centre.
Aujourd'hui, ouais, ça allait impeccable.
So to the salle de presse, still under the escort of Philippe Soud. By Jove, I wouldn't like to read that one. And finally, to the official reception. So after 246 kilometres and over 5 hours in the saddle, this is what the stage winner of a Tour de France has to go through every day. There's no time to be tired. The next day, however, it was heading down on the official rest day of the Tour de France, the riders flying some 500 miles down to Pau. Jean-Marie Leblanc and Jean-Pierre Carenzo, the top men of the Tour de France, welcomed the riders aboard this special charter aircraft. But there was one seat empty, and it was the seat that should have been occupied by Urs Zimmermann of the Motorola team. He hadn't taken the flight, and that was against the rules of the Tour de France, and they had eliminated him from the race. This was to be the first of the big mountain stages between Pau and Jaca in Spain. When the riders were called to the line and the flag was up, when it went down, nobody moved. The riders had not liked the thought of eliminating Zimmermann from the race because he was guilty of not something to do with the Tour de France, but with the organisation, and they felt there should be some other kind of penalty. So they wouldn't start. They also took the opportunity to protest about the wearing of crash helmets, which were compulsory this year, the majority of the riders not wishing to wear them. Urs Zimmermann was given his numbers back, and instead the organisation threw off the race the team manager, Jim Okowitz, who was allowed to stay with the Tour de France but not administer during any of the Tour stages. Then the race got underway, 192 kilometres between Pau and Jaca. Thierry Claverola was amongst the riders launching the early attacks. Dominique Arnoux of the Banesto team loosening up the field too, thinking no doubt of his team leaders, Pedro Delgado and Miguel Indurain. They were on the way home now. The Spanish were expected to do well. A name we should make note of too, Luc Leblanc, because he is a name that will come to the fore by the end of the day. Over the top of the Col de Choudet, still the attacks were coming from a name familiar with us all now, Charlie Motte. He'd won the stage only 2 days previously, rest day in between, and he could even get the double now. The Z team were finding few friends, and Greg LeMond in yellow was finding none. A small breakaway group developed, led by Charlie Motte. Maurizio Fondriest, the Italian, was at the back of the group. Also in it was Pascal Richard, Luc Leblanc and Andy Hampsten. The race behind was splitting up, but not as much as everybody had expected, but the gaps were growing. The main field, which included Greg LeMond, was over 7 minutes behind. LeMond found nobody wanted to chase the men up front, and Motte could not be disregarded. Neither could Andy Hampsten, who had finished fourth in a previous Tour de France in 1986, and Greg LeMond was the first American winner. And Luc Leblanc was becoming the star of the day. This young man, who turned professional when only 20 years of age, had finished 73rd in the Tour de France last year, and now he was going for glory. The race came over the top of the mountain into Spain. It was now all downhill to the finish, and their time gap was too much. They wouldn't be caught today. Fondriest and Hampsten had been dropped on the final climb. There was now only 3 riders left in the front. The main field were going over the top of the climb, just over 7 minutes behind. The main field, by the way, consisted of all of the star names, but it only actually was about 30 strong. Le Mans was running out of time and nobody was helping them. As they came down to the finish in Haka, Charlie Motte taking on Pascal Richard as Luc Leblanc sits out and watches it. And so, 2 stages in a row fell to the Frenchman. Some 2 minutes later, Maurizio Fondriest led home Andy Hampsten. But already, the yellow jersey was now on the shoulders of Luc Leblanc, after Thierry Marie Castorama had found a new star. Eduardo Chozas came in 6th place, and then, just to show himself to the Spanish public, Miguel Indurain took 7th place, 6 minutes 49 seconds after Charlie Motte. And the big group sprint was led home by Frédéric Vichot. Abdoujaparov was right, he couldn't climb, and he'd lost his 2nd place overall. Peter de Klerk had kept his lead in the King of the Mountains. Luc Leblanc was now the leader by 2 minutes and 35 seconds ahead of Greg LeMond, and Charlie Motte had come up into 3rd place. The 13th stage from Haka to val-louron was a brute, 232 kilometres, and this was to be a classic in the very true meaning of the word. Greg LeMond was reading how everybody else had done, and he knew now he was very much alone in this year's Tour de France. Luc Leblanc was the man in the hot seat, and the men everybody should watch, Miguel Indurain and Claudio Chiappucci. They'd waited for this day, which began on the Col du Portalet after only 42 kilometres. Riders taking it largely as a group, because they were thinking now of their ride back into France. Peter de Klerk scoring at the top of the Col du Portalet and consolidating his lead in the King of the Mountains. The riders were back in France with the major climbs of the Pyrenees to come. The Col au Bisque, the Col du Tourmalet and the Col d'Aspin. Not to mention the finish to the top of val-louron. The Col de l'Aubisque, 84 kilometres into the race and the first big challenge. Patrice Esnault, Marc Madiot and Guido Winterberg open up the attacks. Gianni Bugno begins to stretch the field. The pursuit is on now, and the yellow jersey of Luc Leblanc has followed Gianni Bugno in this 2nd group on the road. Missing from this 2nd chase group, which included Miguel Indurain, Greg LeMond and Gianni Bugno and Claudio Chiappucci, was Pedro Delgado. He had already been left behind. Robert Miller, a great climber himself, was feeling the strain of all the chasing over the first 2 weeks in the aid of Greg LeMond. And by the time they got to the Col de Tourmalet, there were a lot of faces we should see at the front who were riding at the back. It was a very, very hot day indeed, and Luc Leblanc was inspired now by the leader's yellow jersey. The pace was being led up the mountain by Claudio Chiappucci. The earlier escapees had been caught. Miguel Indurain was in 2nd place, Motte was 3rd, then Andy Hampsten, Gianni Bugno, Luc Leblanc, and just off the pace in fact was Greg LeMond. Claudio Chiappucci was 1st over the top of the Col de Tourmalet, and then a few seconds later came Greg LeMond with Roberto Conti. And while LeMond was struggling just off the back of the leaders, Miguel Indurain launched the attack. When LeMond got back to the leading group, Indurain had gone. So it was Miguel Indurain who led off down to the bottom of the Col de Tourmalet and the town of Saint-Marie-de-Campin, and then the turn towards the Col d'Aspin. Miguel Indurain had been told, in fact, that Claudio Chiappucci was chasing. He's back. Claudio Chiappucci joined him at the front, and Luc Leblanc was now also on the defensive. There were now 2 riders in the lead, Miguel Indurain and Claudio Chiappucci, as they arrived at the Col d'Aspin after 183 kilometres. There were massive crowds awaiting now in the Pyrenees, because everybody knew that this was the day there would have to be some decisions in the Tour de France before they started to move across the valleys heading towards the Alps. Luc Leblanc was in trouble, and so too was Greg LeMond. He was on his own when the team car belonging to Gianni Bugno hit him on the back wheel and knocked him off. Later on in the day, the team manager apologised to Greg. It certainly wasn't intentional. Greg LeMond was finding when your luck is out, it's really out. At the top of the Col d'Aspin, Chiappucci was again first over it and building a lead now in the King of the Mountains competition. The rest of the race behind were realising they'd made a grave error in allowing these two their freedom. Maybe still the finishing climb to come. My goodness me, they had the gap and it was growing. Heading down towards the finish at val-louron, and the two riders were still holding a lead of over 1.5 minutes on Gianni Bugno, who is now reportedly chasing on his own. Claudio Chiappucci gets his first ever stage win in a major event, which is surprising. He finished second in the Tour de France a year ago. 1 second later was Miguel Indurain to become the new leader of the Tour. And Bugno finished third. Laurent Fignon came home in 4th place, a magnificent last few kilometres, but 2 minutes 50 seconds after the arrival of Claudio Chiappucci. It had taken its toll as well. And the star of the last couple of days of the Tour de France, Charlie Motte, finishes 5th, 3 minutes 53 seconds back. Andy Hampsten in 6th place. Eduardo Chozas was 7th. And Eric Bowyer, who waited for Greg LeMond, leads him home in 8th place. The American had lost over 7 minutes. And Jean-Francois Bernard, he was 10th. So the cuddly Claudio Chiappucci was now the leader in the King of the Mountains and the day's winner, and it was a marvellous stage to have won. But the new leader of the Tour now was a Spaniard, Miguel Indurain. It had taken him 58 hours and 51 minutes to build a 3 minutes lead over Charlie Motte, 3 minutes 10 seconds over Bugno, and 4 minutes 6 seconds over Claudio Chiappucci. Greg LeMond had fallen back to 5th place, 5 minutes and 8 seconds behind. His Tour hopes were now over. Would he even finish the Tour? That was the question on everybody's lips. So to the 14th stage of the Tour de France, which took the riders from Saint-Gaudens to Castres, 172 kilometres. The big climbs were now gone, but the sun was so hot it was like riding through a furnace. Miguel Indurain had accomplished everything he'd set out to do. He'd planned all along to put his attack in the Pyrenees. He knew what that stage had to offer. The riders who accused him of riding along for 11 days and hiding were right, but then he knew what was to come, and he'd made the most of it. He'd now got the leader's yellow jersey in the Tour de France, and he wasn't going to give it up for anything. The next 3 days in the Tour de France was in fact to be about Italy, because the Ariostoia team were now going to give us a demonstration of what it was like to win stages. The Banestos had fooled the Castoramas and they were spraying them with water. They now had the leader on their team. The heat really was oppressive. It was probably the hottest period in the Tour de France for many, many years. There were few attacks to talk of in the next few hours of racing. Riders' tribe were quickly brought back to heel. Small groups escaped and were then trapped again. The riders always vigilant with the Banesto team, although they were caught off guard occasionally. And then Miguel Indurain knew he had to watch for himself. Towards the end, Kengi Alta of Italy broke clear. This was the rider who had given Rolf Sorensen, his teammate, his bike when he crashed on the road to Valenciennes to get him home, only to find he'd broken his collarbone and was out of the Tour. Now Kengi Alta was able to race for himself, and the stage win was just around the corner. Cheered all the way up the home straight at Castres, Kengi Alta was the winner. Ariostoia had got a stage win. It also fooled the top French sprinter, Jean-Claude Carlotti, who finished 20 seconds later, just a second ahead of Giovannetti, the former Italian winner of the Tour of Spain. In the small group that followed, Andreas Kapus was fourth, none of these riders were affecting the overall situation. And then our old friend Abdoujaparov cleaned up 56 seconds later for 8th place. Even Laurent Fignon, it seems, was learning to sprint as well. Overall, there was no change at all, and still Indurain headed 3 minutes Charlie Motte, 3 minutes 10 seconds Gianni Bugno. Now, the Tour de France is a happy family, and happy families have to have villages to live in. And in the middle of the night, every day, the riggers go down and set up the Tour Village. This is a place where everybody can come, and it's open 2 hours before the race starts. If you've got a tour pass, you can go in, you can meet the city dignitary, the riders, have a cup of tea, and if you fancy, even a glass of wine at 8 o'clock in the morning.
Tell me, doctor, where are we going this time?
It's the sort of place where the previous day's stage winner comes and he's made a big fuss of. But if you are the centre of controversy, then you tend to stay in your team car. So the 15th stage, taking the riders 235 kilometres from Albi to Alps. It was through beautiful countryside, but the heat was still there. The riders were still being suppressed by what was very, very warm conditions. A mechanical problem for Laurent Fignon, but he knew there'd be no problem catching up either, because the riders were in no mood to race quickly. This 15th stage too, there were no attacks to talk of at all day. The riders just rode along. It was the sort of day that Indurain was pleased about. Nobody was attacking him. The hotspot sprints didn't carry any more time bonuses, and the riders continued to dig, especially Claudio Chiappucci, for the few points at stake on the small mountain climbs. They weren't really mountains at all. They were 3rd and 4th category hills, but Chiappucci was doing well. The last climb was steep, although not long, and it was 60 kilometres from the finish. Moreno Argentin of the Ariostia team decided it was time to break clear. Meanwhile, there was quite a serious crash in the bunch, and this was Sean Yates. A brake lever had gone into his arm. Sean Yates was to be dressed up and would finish the stage, but he was advised and didn't start the next day. Argentin knew nothing of the crash to Sean Yates. He was now settling in to try and stay clear. He built a lead of a couple of minutes. Belgian rider Eric van der Aarde was driving the charge. He was a sprinter who'd lost his chance by yet another attack from the Italian Ariostia team. A team that had known disappointment with the loss of Rolf Sorensen, but in 2 days running now, they were to know the sweet smells of victory. Yesterday it had been Kelge Alta. Today it was Moreno Argentin, winner of this year's Liège-Bastogne-Liège and the Flèche Wallonne Classics. Still no change at all overall. Motte 3 minutes behind, Bugno 3:10, Chiappucci 4th at 4 minutes 6 seconds. So it was the 16th stage now from Alès to Gap, 215 kilometres, and then the riders would be in the shadows of the next obstacles, the Alps. The weather was only slightly cooler, but then the roads were hillier, so the pace was pretty much the same. Nothing to get excited about. Miguel Indurain had not been put under too much pressure as leader of the Tour de France, and yet before this Tour de France began, the newspapers had warned of the undulations between the Pyrenees and the Alps, because they said it was in this area where the Tour de France could be won and lost. Well, that wasn't to prove to be true, but Indurain was certainly put under pressure when there was an attack, and his Banesto team were forced to chase for a long time. The two men who'd made the attack and were given their head, Laurent Fignon and Gianni Bugno. Also here too, and we didn't see too much of him, was 141, Gert-Jan Teunissen. This was a cheeky attack. Chiappucci was in it as well, and it forced the others to chase. They caught up, and the man who launched the counter-attack was Greg LeMond. Everybody had been waiting for days to see Greg LeMond throw the towel in. It never even entered his head. Greg LeMond had seen his chance and was now going clear of the field on the race down towards Gap. Indurain and the Banesto team had been under pressure. It took them 25 miles, some 40 kilometres, to bring back that attack by Fignon, Chiappucci and Bugno, and they were in no mood now to go after Le Monde. Le Monde was joined by Marco Lieti, yes, another Ariostia rider, and Lieti was beating Le Monde in gap. A few years ago, when Lieti wasn't a professional cyclist, he'd seen Greg LeMond ride past in the Tour of Italy, and one day he'd hoped to emulate him. I bet he never thought he'd beat him in gap. Maurizio Fondries just cleared the field, took third place, and Jean-Claude Colotti, will he ever win the stage? He finished fourth. This was happy days for Marco Lieti. 3 days running for the Ariostia team. And now it was back into D-Day time for the Tour de France, because the stage of 125 kilometres took the riders away from Gap to the high mountain of Alpe d'Huez, that famous cycling shrine where the race is so often decided. Alpe d'Huez is 9 miles and takes the riders up to 1,860 metres. That comes at the very end of the stage. And of course, on this stage as well, there were other climbs of note to come too. If you remember last year in the Tour de France, it was Robert Miller who paced the yellow jersey of Ronan Pensek up the mountain. Pensek was in trouble. Miller saved the day for him. That wasn't the case this year. Jean-Francois Bernard certainly was pacing the yellow jersey of Miguel Indurain, but Indurain wasn't in trouble. Fignon, the grand old man and double winner of the Tour de France, was still full of fight. He was having his best tour. Luc Leblanc, the yellow jersey in the Pyrenees, had fallen off. It was on his way back. Jean-Francois Bernard was in trouble halfway up. His pacemaking had been great for Miguel Indurain, but he was paying the price. But Indurain and Bugno were proving absolutely inseparable. Back to the group came Luc Leblanc. At the finishing line, Gianni Bugno, the Italian who won here a year ago, became the first Italian to win here 2 years running. There was no time gap between him and the yellow jersey. So Bugno had won the Tour de France stage, but he hadn't won the Tour de France, and it didn't look likely now. Ballesteros the golfer was happy to speak in his home tongue to the new champion of France, Miguel Indurain. The Spaniard led the Tour de France now from Bugno by 3 minutes 9 seconds. Chiappucci was in third place, 4 minutes 48 back. Charlie Motte was fourth, and Greg LeMond was still there in fifth place.
Indurain est le plus fort. Donc il a 3 minutes plus la marche théorique du contre-la-montre. Donc ça fait quand même beaucoup.
Marc Madio, the winner of Paris-Roubaix. He certainly wouldn't be the winner of the Tour de France. And I think as far as he was concerned, Miguel Indurain was now going to be just that. Lower down the climb, Gianni Bugno was still setting the pace, but not attacking. He needed to rid himself of Miguel Indurain, and Indurain just followed him everywhere he went. Bugno, Claudio Chiappucci, Indurain, Stephen Rooks. That was the order. And then down at the finishing line in Morzine, a new finish for a change in Morzine, Thierry Claverola produced the best finish. Local man Thierry Bourguignon had to be content with second place. He'd worked hard for a result though in 2 days, and he got one with that second place. The main mountains in this year's Tour de France were now behind the riders, and there were still 160 of them left in the race. Indurain's lead, 3 minutes 9 seconds over Bugno. Chiappucci was third, 4 minutes 48 seconds back. Fourth was Charlie Motte, fifth was Luc Leblanc, and sixth was Laurent Fignon. Greg LeMond has shown great strength of character to fight back on the road along to Morzine, and was now in 8th place, but 14 minutes and 1 second behind Miguel Indurain. One more long road race to come, the 19th stage from Morzine taking the riders to Aix-les-Bains, 177 kilometres. Plenty of attacks to keep the race alive, but it was very hard to find an attack that would work. There was a long attack in which rider number 47, Melchior Mauri, the winner of the Tour of Spain, gained more than 5 minutes. Normally, that would have been enough to win the stage. But gradually, the race chased him down, and when his lead was down to just over a minute, he had the bad luck to puncture. Soon after that, he was caught. Melchor Mauri, a new name in the world of cycling, had dominated the Tour of Spain almost from start to finish. He wasn't going to dominate this stage of the Tour de France. The Banestos had their control of the race, and then the race began to split up as it came towards the finish. Miguel Indurain only had to watch two names now, Gianni Bugno and Claudio Chiappucci. The rest could never possibly recoup the time they'd lost in the race so far. And it was the Banesto team setting the pace, knowing now that the winner of this Tour de France was surely riding on their team. Heading down towards Aix-les-Bains, the Soviet rider Dmitry Konishev and the former Swiss champion Pascal Richard from the Helvetia team had gone clear. Roberto Conti, a great climber, always has difficulty when it comes to going downhill. At the finish, Konishev was the best sprinter, and Richard had to do with second place. So the Soviet man was adding to the name of Abdoujaparov. He was the first Soviet to win a stage of the Tour de France in Po a year ago. Now he'd won at Aix-les-Bains. Of course, there had been no change at all overall, as the riders faced up to the 160 kilometres, taking them away from Aix-les-Bains to Mâcon and the destiny of the final time trial. Konishev was flying now, having well recovered from his broken collarbone in the Tour of Spain. The rain was still coming down, but it was showing signs of clearing up. But the big crashes continued as rider after rider touched a wheel and fell off. Valerio Tebaldi, a winner of two stages in the Tour de France, was one of the fallers there, but he'd finish, albeit 19 minutes behind the day's winner. Brian Home, number 173, joined on the attack by a number of riders, but it's the Carrera team who start to chase down. They want their man, Djamolidine Abdoujaparov, to win the sprint. And so the big peloton comes back as Hendrik Redant makes a last-gasp attempt to go away. But he's caught as well, and then the sprinters settled in for the big finish in Mâcon. But they forgot all about the Soviet pursuiter, Vyacheslav Yekimov. The reigning World Pursuit champion comes home as winner of the stage. And so a third Soviet name is added to the honours list of the Tour de France. The Soviets, now professional, are getting to like the habit of winning stages in this great race. He'd won by 7 seconds, upsetting the rhythm of Abdoujaparov, who finished second. If you look back on how he will win this Tour de France, you'll find he won both time trials and finished second on both of the mountain stages that mattered. Miguel Indurain now led the Tour de France by 3 minutes and 36 seconds, and there was just the ride into Paris to come. But it wasn't Indurain who saw the Eiffel Tower first, it was the American Greg LeMond. Later on, when I spoke to Greg, he said it was a little bit of theatre. My goodness me, did he make everybody else chase him though? He was the first to see the Eiffel Tower and race down the banks of the Seine. And then came the big finale on the Champs-Élysées. LeMond was swept up, of course. The yellow jersey of Miguel Indurain was never far away from the front. He kept an eye on everybody. The crowd was as big as it's been for years. The racing was fast and furious. The Tour de France had come home. Towards the end of the laps of the Champs-Élysées, Miguel Indurain even found himself in a small breakaway group. Was the yellow jersey going to finish with a flourish and win the final stage? Claudio Chiappucci never far away from him either. But it wasn't to be, and the winner of the Tour de France was Miguel Indurain. Gianni Bugno was in second place. But now let's go back to that first stage and watch the left of your picture. And this is probably the worst crash you'll ever see, and let's hope so, in a stage of the Tour de France. We never want to see worse. The French were commentating, calling it a chute de terrible. Oh, my goodness me, Djamolidine Abdoujaparov went down like a rag doll as he hit one of the Coca-Cola signs in the sprint. He would surely have won the stage. Jan Shaw was one of the fallers there too, and it was Konishev on the right of our picture who won his second stage of the Tour. Djamolidine Abdoujaparov was unable to get up and go and take his final green jersey as points winner of this Tour de France. He did get up though and cross the line, so the jersey was his, as the records will show. But I'm afraid on this day he was already in hospital when the presentations were made. As a postscript, Abdoujaparov is once again winning bike races. But the man that won the Tour de France is a man we'll talk about for many, many years. Only the fourth ever Spanish winner of the Tour. The Spanish knew it, and by the end of the Tour de France, so did we. Miguel Indurain, the winner of the 1991 Tour de France.